Well, let's get more now on that race to become the next Labour leader. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair has said the Labour Party needs to be seized back from the far left if it is to survive. He blames the party's shift to the left for the loss of the election rather than Jeremy Corbyn's neutral stance on Brexit. Well, we can speak now to Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute and Chris Nineham from the Stop the War Coalition. A very good afternoon to you both, gentlemen. Thanks for being with us. Chris, perhaps we can come to you first. What did you make of Tony Blair's comments?
Well, I think he's completely wrong, and I think the evidence is the 2017 election, where we had Jeremy as leader on an equally radical manifesto that we had in the last election, and Labour did fantastically well. They got the biggest surge in support since 1945. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense to argue that. I think people feel we do need to have a change. We do need a break from the years of free market politics and economics and neoliberalism, and that message went down very well in 2017. The problem is it didn't break through in 2019 because of the Brexit question fundamentally, and I think that distorted the election quite deeply. On top of that, I think Labour's shift in their position from essentially arguing for a people's Brexit in 2017 to a second referendum in 2019 and actually looking pretty much like a Remain party was experienced as a betrayal by millions of people in Leave areas, and it kind of undermined the emerging feeling that Jeremy Corbyn was different, that Labour was actually going to break with the past, was going to listen to working people, was going to deliver for working people. And that no longer looks so plausible after this 180-degree turn in the Brexit position.
Okay, well,
so I think those two things are linked. But I mean, the idea that we should go back to Blairism at a time when people are
Tony Blair is someone who won
angry.
3 elections and got a huge majority and did wonders for the Labour Party. I mean, surely he's somebody you should be listening to.
Actually, in 2005, he got less votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019. So we need to look at the facts here. But I think there's absolutely no doubt that millions of people right across the country think the privatisation policies, the kind of rollback of the welfare state, the obsession with big business that was such a big deal under Blair. You know, the Blairites talked about being very, very comfortable with people being super rich. And what's resulted from that, there was an element of continuity from Thatcherism that has led to the gross inequality that people feel now. And I think people are hurting from that. Yeah. People are hurting from that kind of consensus and those kinds of politics. OK, well, let's put those questions to Matthew Lesh. Matthew, do you think it was the manifesto that was the problem, or was it the man?
Look, the Labour Party is a disaster zone, and it's hilarious to hear the kind of denials we're seeing from some elements of the Labour movement. Let's be absolutely clear here. Labour won as few seats as it does in any time since 1935, the worst result since 1935. It is a party that has been taken over by a militant far-left clique. It is losing its traditional working class base, and meanwhile it still has not dealt with its institutional anti-Semitism problem. This wasn't just an election about Brexit. Of course, it was partly about Brexit. This was a damning indictment on Jeremy Corbyn and a damning indictment on Corbynism and socialism, and a manifesto that was so unviable, unbelievable, and quite frankly, as one Labour Party MP said, economically illiterate, to be absolutely absurd. And I think the Labour Party right now has a choice. I just want to go down this extremist, Trotskyist line where it tries to yell from the opposition benches for 30, 40 years in the hope of someday getting in power. Does it become just a party of protest, or does it actually reform itself for, quite frankly, the good of the country and become a viable party of government and a viable party of opposition that can hold the government to account?
Matthew, just staying with you, what do you make then of Sir Keir Starmer's comments today, where he said that the party has to be careful of moving too far away from the left and oversteering it?
I mean, fundamentally, Labour's problem is that its metropolitan domination of its leadership in inner London is so far disconnected from the rest of the country and its values and its culture. And that's why you've seen Labour do relatively well in London and university towns, but do quite rubbish everywhere else. You can look at someone like Emily Thornberry, who is alleged, although she notably denies it, but the allegation itself stands, that she called all Leave voters stupid. I don't think that's the kind of attitude that's going to work whatsoever if you want to become Labor Party leader and reconnect to your traditional base. I think the Labor Party needs to have a long, hard look at its policies and really consider whether or not it wants to be the party of a smaller economy, of redistribution, of failed economic socialist policies, or if it wants to reclass itself as a party that will actually help the worst off with growth-based policies that will actually grow our economy.
OK, well, let's talk about the leadership then, because you brought up Emily Thornberry. Chris, she's the first person today to throw her hat in the ring officially. Who do you think is the right person to take Labour forward?
Well, I don't want to endorse any particular candidate, but partly because at the moment I don't see a candidate who is genuinely, in a serious way, going to carry forward the most important and most crucial thing, really, about what's happened in Labour in the last 4 or 5 years, i.e. the radical economic and social policies. What I do think is that to have a kind of rich lawyer who was a very strong Remainer living in London, or someone like Emily Thornberry, who is certainly nowhere near as kind of as good on economic and social policies, wouldn't be, and also is a very strong Remainer. Doesn't seem to me to be a sensible policy. I think the problem with Matthew's analysis is that it just doesn't fit the facts. I mean, 2 years ago, Jeremy Corbyn did extremely well for Labour, and everyone has to accept that it was a very good result given the starting point, on the basis of a radical economic programme and a radical economic policy. And the idea that Brexit wasn't the central question in the last election isn't borne out by the fact, first of all, that the Tories relentlessly, and Boris Johnson relentlessly, pursued the question as basically pretty much the only thing that he said. And also on the question of the economics, I mean, the Tories themselves moved to the left on economic questions. They said they were having spent 9 years running down the NHS. Suddenly they were going to pump billions and billions of pounds into it. So that suggests to me that the Corbyn leadership actually has successfully won some of the arguments around austerity, around privatisation, around the free market. And I think in those circumstances, it would be disastrous to backtrack on that. So I would like to see a candidate who is as radical as Jeremy Corbyn and has some sense of the extent to which there's massive anger and discontent over the way this country has been run for decades. And that's the important thing for me.
OK, Chris, well, let's get Matthew's thoughts on that then. Who would you like to see leading the Labour Party?
Perhaps Ergon Clogg, maybe? I don't know, somebody who can actually win elections, perhaps someone who can actually take the country forward and is popular and from the north, or at least based in the north. Look, I think this is an absolute myth about 2017. The Labor Party actually, despite claims otherwise, lost the election in 2017, and then they lost the election in 2019. For me, this is a bit less about personalities and a bit more about what these people are actually going to represent and what kind of voters they can speak to, and whether or not they're going to actually be able to take Labor back to be a viable electoral force in future. And as much as some people might like to dismiss Tony Blair, presuming this Parliament runs to the end of its term, Tony Blair will be the only Prime Minister in 50 years who has won government, won a majority for the Labor Party. That's extraordinary failure of the Labor movement when it comes to its leadership in election after election after election, and when it comes to its mandate, and when it comes to its ability to connect to voters.
I'm going to leave the final thought to you, Chris. Perhaps I can quote what Tony Blair did say. He said that Labour is marooned on Fantasy Island.
Yeah, but I think we have to be very clinical about the record and the legacy of Blairism, because I think that actually it is true that there is an underlying pattern of a decline in Labour's base in many working class areas, particularly in the Midlands and in the North. This happened mainly under Blair's leadership, because although he did win 3 elections, his vote went down and down and down, and particularly in those kinds of areas. And that's because that Labour did nothing for people who were languishing in areas where there was massive deindustrialisation, where workplaces were being closed down, where there was high unemployment, where welfare was being rolled back. And actually the local Labour councils had a particularly poor record of standing up against the Tories. And so the kind of accommodation to at least some of Thatcherite politics and economics that Blair represented was an underlying disaster. And I think what happened in 2017 was that a new leadership with a very different approach, with an insurgent attitude, was saying, we're going to change that. We're going to pump millions and billions of pounds into the welfare state. We're going to renationalise key industries. We're going to look for better jobs. We're going to respect trade union rights. And that broke through to a certain extent in 2017 and began to reverse the drift, began to reverse the decay. The problem is that in this last election, that was no longer the kind of dynamic of Labour's campaign for a number of reasons, I think, but mainly because people in Leave areas, which after all were the majority of the marginals, people felt as if, hang on a minute, actually this leadership, this Labour leadership, isn't that different because it's not listening to us, because it's being undemocratic. And I think that was a big disaster, but we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking the problem was, and obviously people on the right, like Matthew, are going to argue this, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that people are happy with inequality, that people are happy with the privatisation of the NHS, that people are happy with the massive, massive cuts to our welfare system, that people are happy with homelessness. Of course they're not, and we have to reflect that in the movement.
And I'm sure it will be much discussed around dinner tables over the Christmas period, but we must leave it there. Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute, Chris Nyman from Stop the War Coalition. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.